I'm somewhat familiar with Scandinavia, so I know the law of Jante. And I know that kind of introduction is only embarrassing. Thank you very much. We are going to talk about entrepreneurship. John Chisholm, my colleague, is an entrepreneur. I'm not. I'm just a teacher and a scholar. And in fact, early in my career as a tough little Chicago economist, quantitative mathematical type I was very hostile to the idea of entrepreneurship as important. And that's just because I didn't understand it correctly. I'm not so sure that other people at the time understood it correctly either. My friend, friendly enemy, David Landis, a great economic historian, would always emphasize entrepreneurship, but what he meant was an internal psychological state. This is in accord with Max Weber's great book, 1905, the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, where the idea is that a psychological change, in that case caused by the becoming a Calvinist, made people work harder, made them more attentive to, the world, and made for economic growth. And I've finally come around to thinking that entrepreneurship is the key to how economies work. I've become more and more of an Austrian economist as I've gotten older. Of course, I've been everything. My first formation was as an anarchist. But not the kind that my colleague was talking about. Not that kind of anarchist, not a free market anarchist, but a socialist anarchist. Prince Kropotkin was my hero, my first hero. And then Marx, and then Keynes, and then, I've been everything. I've been an atheist. Now I'm an Anglican, if you think that's an improvement. And I was a man, and now I'm a woman, and that definitely is an improvement. So I've been everything. So I can understand our friends on the left, not so much our friends on the right, but our friends on the left, when they feel hostile and worried by markets and entrepreneurship. But I don't think that the change that made the modern world entrepreneurially was a psychological change. I think there are probably, in this population, say, 10% of us, maybe 15%, who want to innovate radically, whether in business terms or intellectual terms. I don't mean that the others are useless dolts. I don't mean that. They have honorable roles in the society, but the true entrepreneurs are rare. And as I think all our speakers will emphasize, they too often make mistakes. Surely the government does, but as a famous coach in the United States said, Yogi Berra, he said, it's hard to predict, especially about the future. And it surely is. So entrepreneurship is not mechanical, but so far as psychological readiness for it, I think perhaps 10 or 15%. But in different times and in different countries, there have been radically different attitudes towards entrepreneurship. For example, India. A student of mine named Adya did a very interesting PhD dissertation looking at attitudes towards the economy shown in movies in India, Bollywood movies. and he watched lots of these movies, which sounds like a nice way to do a PhD in economics. And he found that in the 50s and the 60s, in the first mad enthusiasm for socialism in India, the heroes of the Bollywood movies were all government employees, policemen, government planners, government agricultural extension workers. They were the good guys. And the bad guys, as they are in Swedish crime fiction, were all entrepreneurs. We're all business people. And this, after 20 years of the recenserats, where to move a machine in your own factory, you had to get planning permission from the government, and the man from the government, surprise, surprise, had his hand out for a bribe. I saw such a bribe being paid in India just last year. So even so, it hasn't changed completely. The Bollywood plots shifted, and they turned completely around. And in the 70s and 80s, before acknowledgement of the entrepreneur and the liberal idea, as Nick was saying earlier, that the private sector might be able to do it even better maybe than the government, this ideological change had taken place. Now my theme in this series is that. These are marvelous books which you may buy on Amazon. This is the Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. And it's a virtue ethical approach for those of you interested in this sort of thing. Not utilitarian, not Kantian, but Aristotelian, so to speak, arguing that a life in business is not ipso facto corrupting. Now, since most intellectuals believe it is, especially those who aren't in business, this is a somewhat heavy load of persuasion I have, which means it's a very thick book, 500 pages on this matter, showing that you can be a virtuous person. You can have courage and justice and love, temperance, prudence, of course, hope and faith, and yet still be a private supplier of private goods. I then turned to the outstanding question in economics, having made an apology in the Greek sense, a defense of the entrepreneur in this book. I then asked, well, are the other explanations, the non-entrepreneurial explanations that I had sponsored for the first half of my career, that I against entrepreneurship? No, it's capital formation, you dope. Don't you understand? Aren't you an economist? It's trade. I went through all these explanations and found that I was wrong when I was young to reject human creativity as the economic cause of the modern world. And in this book, I go through all of them, at least as many as I can. I mean, every economic historian makes a reputation by proposing still another explanation for how we got so rich. And many of the economists, Acemoglu and so forth, have their own explanations, and I go through all of them. Doug North, my old friend who died last year, he has an explanation having to do with institutions and coal. Everyone loves coal. Non-economists especially like coal is the explanation. The British sit on a mountain of coal, therefore they industrialized. They don't explain why the Dutch, who didn't have any coal, but could import it across the North Sea, why they didn't have an industrial revolution until very late, yet they were the first commercial country in Northern Europe, the first bourgeois society in Northern Europe. The beginning of the modern world happened in Amsterdam. And it doesn't explain why the Chinese, who have been exploiting coal on a somewhat massive scale for 3 millennia, didn't have an industrial revolution. So I concluded, as you see from the title, Bourgeois Dignity, why economics can't explain the world, can explain the modern world, that the elevation of the bourgeoisie to social dignity is crucial for the modern world, for enrichment. It's not this internal psychology that Max Weber talked about, or that David Landis talked about. It's the attitude of the surrounding society that matters. Are they dignified? In India in the 1950s, they weren't. In India in the 1980s, they were. And this made all the difference. Then in the third volume, the concluding volume of this trilogy, I was going to make it 6 volumes at one point. And in a vulgar combination of Latin and Greek, I was going to call it a sexology and sell many, many more copies, alas, than I'm going to sell, unless you help me out here. But I had decided that although a trilogy might be considered somewhat self-indulgent, a tetralogy is an abomination, and a sexology doesn't meet the minimum standards of bourgeois virtue, because it's fraud, and we free market people are against fraud and violence. So anyway, this is an attempt at explaining why the bourgeoisie became dignified. And the answer, I think, well, let's first understand the magnitude of the phenomenon that we're trying to explain. If you don't understand anything about economic history in the last 2 centuries, understand this. That the factor of increase that we're talking about for, say, Sweden, which in 1800 has been called the impoverished sophisticate. Well, my old teacher of mine, Lars Sandberg, wrote a famous essay about this a long time ago. Sweden in 1800 was the poorest country in Europe per capita. The only exception was Russia, which was poorer. And yet, look around you now, or look at Sweden in 1950. Sweden is now one of the richest countries in the world. And the factor of increase is about 30. Income per head in Sweden in 1800 was perhaps, in modern terms, in terms that you can understand as you walk out the door and attempt to live on it, was $3 a day per person. $3 a day. Now you sound, my God, $3 a day? How could anyone live on $3 a day? Well, a substantial percentage of the world's population still does. Now that percentage has been falling like a stone in the last 40 years, especially in the last 15 years. But still, there are people who live on $3 a day in Chad and Bangladesh, parts of it, and so forth. All right, and now in Sweden it's about $100 a day, or up to the 120. Most irritatingly, the land of my ancestors, or some of my ancestors, Norway, is richer now. I know this is irritating to Swedish people, but it's true, and it's oil. I accept that, but still, it's great it's very pleasing to the ghost of my grandfather. He used to say, and this was an American, a Norwegian American who made up this rhyme. He used to say, 10,000 Swedes went through the weeds one day at Copenhagen. 10,000 Swedes went through the weeds, all chased by one Norwegian. But okay. So that's the transformation. Norway was also unspeakably poor in 1800. Yet, everyone could read, as for the most part it was true in Sweden too. So they were ready when in the middle of the 19th century, liberalism came. Free trade, ending of great restrictions on movement and occupation, licensure and banking and so forth. There was this explosion. So that's the magnitude we have to explain. And that's why I say in this middle book, why economics can't explain the modern world. Because supply and demand economics, which I teach and I love and is just wonderful, can't explain this. What we call in the trade Harburger triangles can't explain a factor of 30. That's 3,000% approximately. In fact, there's a case to be made that it's much higher because the quality of goods has enormously improved and continues to. I think it's actually accelerated in improvement. When I was young, we changed tires very frequently, not because they wore out, although they did, but because they blew out. And I'm very good at changing tires. And now tires have improved to the point where you don't change tires very often. And they last for 40,000 miles instead of 4,000. Automobiles themselves last much longer. So there's been, and economics is better than it was, although it's been receding in the hands of Paul Krugman, but still. So in this final book, which is thick because I'm cramming all the volumes 3, 4, 5, 6 into one volume, I'm trying to explain why entrepreneurship became important. And that is, why it did, how it did, not why in the sense of the final cause, as Aristotle would say, but the efficient cause, that is, why did it happen? The answer, I think, is the coming of liberal ideas. And I mean this, you'll notice that the title is Bourgeois Equality. This is sort of a finger in the eye of Thomas Piketty, who I'm not contemptuous of. I wrote a long review, which you can find online, of his book, but it's a serious book, wrong, but serious. And that's what liberalism is. Adam Smith, the blessed Adam Smith, was above all an egalitarian. Now, we're not accustomed, if you haven't actually read Adam Smith and haven't read both of his books, he only wrote 2 books, he wouldn't be a distinguished professor in the modern world. 2 books, come on, that's 2. But in his 2 books, his theme is that ordinary people are creative. Ordinary people should be left to laissez-faire, the famous answer of the manufacturers in Paris. Laissez-faire is an assumption that ordinary people, as adults, as free adults, will and can take care of themselves. Now, I'm a Christian libertarian. I'm an Anglican, if you call that a Christian. And I believe that I have an obligation to help the poor. But my theme is that the best way to help the poor is to allow the economy to grow. And you allow the economy to grow by giving scope to entrepreneurs. And if you don't give scope, then all you can do to help the poor is to take from some people like me and give it to them. But that doesn't give you a factor of 30, even for the poor. It might increase the income of the very poor 50% or 100%, not 3,000%. It's modern economic growth that we need for the poor of the world, and have been getting to an extraordinary degree, especially in the last 15 years, despite the Great Recession. This is the time, I'm a historian, so I think in somewhat longer times than most people, but this is the time of the fastest economic growth in world history. Now. It's happening in China and India. In a couple of generations, India will have, if it continues on its present path of well over 5% per capita growth per year, in a couple of generations, maybe 2.5, it'll have an income equal to that of the United States now, per capita income. All right, so that's what we need to explain, and I say it's ideas, not investment. Investment is necessary. Piling brick on brick is necessary. Piling BAs on BAs to think of human capital is a good thing. But it's not initiating. It's ideas, entrepreneurial ideas. Buy low, sell high. Seeing $100 bills, as we said in the Chicago school, lying on the floor and picking them up. That's what initiates the investment. The investment is there. In the old days, we used to think that investment or capital was the constraint. I don't think so. Someone mentioned Ghana. We poured foreign aid into Ghana. Ghana, if what Bill Easterly calls capital fundamentalism were correct, that you could just push dams on Ghana and it would be better off, or build roads and be better off. If that worked, Ghana would be rich now. And what we used to call Red China, which didn't get a cent of foreign aid, would be languishing. But it's the other way around. Capital is not an initiating force. It comes, as economic historians have discovered, the early Industrial Revolution didn't depend on massive amounts of capital. The railway age did, but that was well into this. And to this day, you can start a firm. You don't have to have large amounts of capital. You can start and use trade capital. You can use your credit cards and get a whole bunch of them and start out that way, or you can get loans from your uncle, or you can use retained earnings, which is the way most companies go. So it's not capital, it's not institutions, it's entrepreneurship, it's innovation, although I don't much like the word innovation. I prefer trade-tested betterment. In the same way that the word capitalism turns us away from what's the key point here, and makes us think that it's the accumulation of capital that makes us rich. That's wrong. It's ideas. And behind the idea, as I say in this book and try to prove, is the liberal egalitarian idea, equality before the law and equality of social dignity. Now, why did these come? These came because of certain concrete, actual accidents of European history. They didn't come from some deep European superiority. I expect sub-Saharan Africa in 50 or 100 years to have the income of Sweden. I don't see why that wouldn't happen. You'd have to be kind of some sort of racist to think otherwise. And so the whole world will become developed in the next 50 or 100 years, and we'll have the most glorious period of human flourishing in history if we don't screw it up, as we did in August of 1914. So let's try not to do that. The accidents were, I think of as the 4 R's. Here I'll conclude. The 4 R's are reading. The printing press was crucial here. It wasn't invented in Germany. It was invented in China, like practically everything else, up to 1600 and even up to 1700. Invented hundreds of years before in China. So it was reading, the first R. It was the Reformation, but not the way Max Weber viewed it, as this matter of the doctrine of salvation, but the matter of church governance. The well-named Congregationalists, the Puritans, the Reformed Church, chose their own ministers, unlike my Anglicans and your Lutherans, who still had a church hierarchy. The extreme example of this is in the 17th century, the English Quakers, who don't have a minister at all. They just sit around like this and wait for the Holy Spirit to descend. And the revolt, the Dutch revolt against Spain, the 80 Years' War, 80 years up to 1648, which succeeded. It's like Vietnam defeating the United States. The small country defeated the 16th century hegemon, Spain. And the revolutions in England in the 16th century, not so much 1688, which Doug North emphasizes, but the 1640s, the English Civil War, and then the great revolutions of the late 18th century in the United States and France. And those made people bold. Those made ordinary people think that they could have a go. And that's my theme. Ordinary people, I think it's the great hypothesis of 18th century liberal thought, from Voltaire to Mary Wollstonecraft. That's the hypothesis that ordinary people, if left alone, will do well, which was shown to be true in the 19th century, when ordinary people of various kinds were freed. So that's my tale. If you want to get economic growth, let entrepreneurs do their job. Thank you.